Paulogia recently put out a video trying to explain the origins of Christianity without a resurrection. But does his explanation work? Let's get into it. I want to make some preliminary remarks to kind of frame the discussion before we get started. Number one, it's important to note that Paulogia is in fact responding to Gary Habermas in his minimal facts case, trying to provide an account for the origins of Christianity without a resurrection. The goal of this video is to see if this naturalistic hypothesis for the beginning of Christianity without a resurrection would hold up to a more maximal facts approach. While Paul's hypothesis technically explains all of Habermas's facts, even if I would argue it does so poorly, it's important to ask, is it capable of explaining all of the data that we have that are beyond Gary Habermas's facts? If Paulogia's case is incapable of explaining all of the data that we have, even if it successfully refutes Gary Habermas's case for the resurrection, which I'm going to argue that it doesn't for reasons in this video, it would still not suffice as an explanation of the resurrection or of the origins of Christianity. Let's find out why. I have four main issues with Paulogia's hypothesis. We're going to focus on the first one for the vast majority of this video because I think it's the most important contention that I have, and it's this. This hypothesis heavily relies upon three claims that I believe we have good reasons to reject. Underneath Paulogia's 12 relatively undisputed facts, there are presuppositions that need to be examined individually. The first one is from a quote that he reads from Bart Ehrman towards the very beginning of the video.
Any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred.
So, any theory is better than one that contains a miracle? Really? The truth is that any non-zero probability can be overcome in light of new evidence. So unless the skeptic wants to presuppose that miracles are metaphysically impossible, if the Christian provides sufficient evidence to overcome the low prior probability of miracles, then the resurrection of Jesus is rational to believe in. If you hold a presupposition that doesn't allow the evidence to change your mind in practice, you need new presuppositions. We should all be open to go where the evidence leads us, even if it is to a resurrection. It's going to be important to keep track during this video how much of Paulogia's case is simply a theory that doesn't contain a miracle because any theory is better than that, rather than actually explaining the data that we have in favor of the resurrection. So that's the first claim out of three that I think Paulogia's case heavily relies upon. If that is false, then I think his case is going to have a lot of problems. The second claim that he holds that I think has a lot of issues is that the early Christian tradition is an uncontrolled, informal tradition, meaning there were no authoritative witnesses of the tradition, keeping embellishments from creeping in over time, and the early Christian communities felt free to embellish or invent stories to fit the needs of their communities. In other words, according to Paulogia, the early Christian tradition does not have any authoritative witnesses that are keeping embellishments or invented stories from creeping in. This can be found in these couple of clips.
7. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism, with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. Details were embellished or invented to eliminate obstacles to belief, and the narratives most successful at winning converts were repeated. As the movement grew, Peter was not personally present to confirm or correct the adopted narratives. In Galatians, Paul describes meeting James, Peter, and John in Jerusalem, so we know they were all involved in the church. We don't know what any of these men believed about resurrected Jesus, nor what their motivations might have been for joining the movement, since they left us no first-hand accounts telling us. Assuming they came to believe in Jesus' resurrection, that could be explained by social contagion, a model of influence and persuasion. Peter's claim of witnessing the risen Jesus gave the shocked and grieving group hope, which they readily accepted due to bias, predisposition, and the power of Jesus' message. Peter's influence, group dynamics, and cultural factors convinced them of the resurrection through faith, just like every Christian believer since.
As we can see, according to Paulogia, and it's very important for his case, that there are embellishments coming in over time and invented narratives. This allows him to explain away things like the empty tomb.
3. The resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers.
Or group appearances, because, according to him,
supplemental embellishments like an empty tomb, group appearances, and suffering of other witnesses are not facts to be explained, but mere story artifacts of the legendary development described above.
But do we have reasons to doubt that the gospel traditions are informal and uncontrolled? Do we have reasons to believe that there are authoritative witnesses within the tradition and that embellishments are actually not present, and what we have in the gospels are the original messages of the apostles? I think so, and I want to give you 4 of them. The earliest tradition we possess within the Bible, 1 Corinthians 15, which most scholars date to the 30s AD, contains the death for our sins, Jesus' burial, and his resurrection, as well as post-resurrection appearances, which is exactly what is present in the gospel narratives written ostensibly decades later. This consistency contradicts the idea that embellishments were being slowly added over time to fit the needs of Christian communities. Within the Gospels themselves, we have named witnesses of specific events. For example, most of Mark is based on the preaching of Peter. After Peter's 3 denials, it is very clear that Mark's source shifts from Peter to the women named at the empty tomb. These named witnesses would likely serve as the source for some of the traditions they take part in. Number 3, earlier Gospels contain protective anonymity, which points to known individuals within specific communities being referenced. For example, Mark doesn't tell us who cut off the ear of the soldier at Jesus' arrest, while John, which was written after Peter's death, is quick to tell us that Peter was the culprit. Mark also doesn't tell us the disciples that provided the colt for Jesus' triumphal entry, the name of the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, or to whom Jesus said, "Are you so dull?" after being questioned about one of his teachings. This literary device of protective anonymity seeks to protect the identity of those whose lives would potentially be in danger if their identity were to be revealed to the Roman or Jewish authorities. We also have Papias' writings, which directly contradict an informal, uncontrolled tradition. Papias names specific authoritative witnesses, John the Elder and Aristion, who were still alive during the time of his writings. He specifically says that he wanted information from the living voice, a proverb at the time, either from those men directly, John the Elder or Aristion, those who had spoken to them, or from the Apostle Philip's daughters, who Papias also knew. And despite what Paulogia claims in his video, it's important to note that the Gospel authors did intend to write history.
The case is nearly ironclad that the Gospels are complex literary works shaped by various factors rather than straightforward historical accounts.
The current scholarly consensus is that the Gospels are within the genre of ancient biography, which according to David Ahn, ancient biographies were firmly rooted in historical fact rather than literary fiction. We can also see in the Gospels themselves. In Luke's prologue, we see it says, "It seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught." And in John chapter 20, John says, "So then, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you might believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." The third and final claim that I believe Paulogia's case heavily relies upon is the idea that the Gospels are not authored by the men they've been traditionally ascribed to, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These anonymous authors were Greek speakers, not eyewitnesses, or close to any eyewitnesses.
10. Several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting these circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives. The case against the traditional authorship of the Gospels is strong, though too involved to argue here.
Despite Paulogia's claim that the case against traditional authorship is strong, I think this is simply incorrect. It relies almost entirely on arguments from silence and a hyper-skeptical distrust in early Christian communities. The Gospel authors routinely show themselves to be honest and close up to the facts. This can be identified through undesigned coincidences, unexplained allusions, and artless similarities. These phenomena are difficult to explain apart from eyewitness testimony. We have videos on this channel providing examples of some of these phenomena if you're interested. The anonymous gospel hypothesis cannot explain why there is no debate over the authorship of the Gospels like there is over the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is an actually anonymous document. It also cannot sufficiently explain why only these 4 Gospels were accepted as authoritative apart from others, or why these 4 names were chosen. Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses, and Matthew, who wrote his Gospel to the Jewish people, was a tax collector, who were considered traitors of their people. Strike one was the idea that any theory that doesn't contain a miracle is better than one that does. Strike two was the idea that early Christian communities were embellishers or they invented narratives whole cloth in order to suit Christian communities. And strike three is that the gospel authors are anonymous. You're out. On the real, though, I definitely think that Paulogia's case heavily relies upon these three claims, and if they are false, then his hypothesis doesn't even get off the ground. But I have three more additional concerns with his overall hypothesis. The first is that Simon Peter would most likely not have been able to convince James, the brother of Jesus, to join a movement claiming that his brother is the Messiah, given his prior disbelief in him and the shameful nature of Jesus' death. Paulogia might want to explain away James's prior skepticism as an embellishment, but I've already explained why that doesn't work. And in Mark chapter 3 it says, when his own family heard about this, they came out to take custody of him, and they were saying, he lost his senses. And John 7:5 says, for not even his brothers believed in him. Crucifixion was designed to be the most agonizing and shameful way to die. If James didn't believe in his brother during his ministry, why should we think that Peter would be able to convince him that Jesus was in fact the Messiah after such a shameful death? This fact is much better explained by 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul tells us that the risen Jesus appeared to James. My next concern is that Paul would not have been within a psychological state to hallucinate about the risen Jesus.
Per his own letters, Paul had multiple visionary experiences throughout his life, which significantly influenced his ministry and teachings. He was prone to them. His persecution of Christians may well have caused him profound guilt and cognitive dissonance. This psychological distress, possibly resembling post-traumatic stress disorder, could have triggered a psychotic break, manifesting as a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Paul's subsequent conversion to Christianity may have served as a coping mechanism to resolve his inner turmoil, alleviate guilt, and find a new purpose in life.
Paul was vehemently opposed to Christianity. He was killing Christians before converting and completely changing his lifestyle. He was on his way to kill more Christians when he claimed to encounter the risen Jesus. We learn from his later ministry that he was a very dedicated man, and he would have been laser focused on his goal to continue to gain status within his Pharisaical ranks. He had nothing to gain from converting to Christianity and everything to lose. This is not the kind of psychological state we would expect a man to be in before experiencing a vision of someone he had never met. N.T. Wright has also pointed out that a bodily resurrection was not the expectation of first century Jews, making it even more unlikely that this would be the experience he would claim to have. It's also important to point out how unlikely it would be that he would have an experience so close to that of Simon Peter that when Paul visited him and James in Galatians chapter 1, that they would have agreed on their experiences. My last issue with Paulogia's case has to do with this clip right here.
Historical evidence suggests that the key figures in our hypothesis, Peter, Paul, and James, were likely killed in the 60s AD. If 2nd century historian Tacitus is correct, Emperor Nero blamed Christians for a devastating fire in Rome and executed Peter and Paul as scapegoats whose recanting would not have saved them.
My contention is going to be that Peter and Paul and James had opportunities to recant long before they would have been killed by Emperor Nero. According to Paul's writings, he was beaten, imprisoned, and routinely treated poorly by communities he would go to preach the gospel to. According to the book of Acts, Peter and John and Paul were addressed by the Jewish authorities and told to stop preaching. They were all thrown in jail for their preaching on separate occasions. We have reason to trust this testimony because Luke does not exaggerate the persecution that takes place and even mentions when the apostles are not brought in by force or punished, like in Acts chapter 4. If they were persecuted throughout their ministries, then even if they couldn't recant before being killed by Nero, this wouldn't change the fact that they would most likely recant while being imprisoned, beaten, flogged, or facing other forms of persecution.
In short, to account for the established history of Christianity, and indeed Gary Habermas's minimal facts, we need only a single disciple to believe Jesus rose, and a later convert who hallucinated the same, and a well-marketed legend to spread.
But has he really or plausibly explained the data, though? It seems to me that the early Christian communities were formal, controlled traditions, which means that there would have been authoritative witnesses keeping embellishments or invented narratives from coming in. This means that the Gospels and the content contained within them would largely reflect the teaching of the original 12 apostles. The case against traditional authorship is weak, relies almost entirely on arguments from silence, and a hyper-skepticism of early Christian communities. And if my claims about miracles are true, then that means not just any theory is better than one that contains a miracle. And with all the other problems we've brought up in this video, it seems to me that Paulogia hasn't given a plausible explanation for the resurrection or for the origins of Christianity.
The ball is in your court, Dr. Habermas.
Actually, Paulogia, the ball's in yours. Thank you so much for watching this video. This was a response to Paulogia's hypothesis for the origins of Christianity without a resurrection. Hopefully we can now see that the resurrection is still in fact the best hypothesis. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.